They called her Whisper Death, but nobody in Delta Force knew why. When the operator demanded her identity in that desert compound, Hadley Perez didn't answer with words. What happened in the next 40 seconds would make a decorated Special Forces soldier realize he'd been training his entire life for a moment he wasn't prepared for. This is the story of the woman they dismissed as too emotional, too soft, too European for American military operations, until the day she saved 12 lives and rewrote every assumption about what makes a warrior. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The sun beat down on forward operating base Viper with the kind of relentless intensity that turned metal equipment too hot to touch. Hadley Perez stood in the shadow of the communications building, watching dust devils spiral across the compound's perimeter. Her shift monitoring intelligence traffic had ended 20 minutes ago, but she lingered, listening to the radio chatter from the patrol returning from Sector 9 at a T-23. Hadley had been stationed at Viper for 11 months, and every single day felt identical to the last. She was the translator, the cultural advisor, the intelligence analyst who could speak 4 languages fluently and understand 3 more well enough to catch the nuances that automated systems missed. Her personnel file called her an asset. Her fellow soldiers called her the European, sometimes with fondness, often with a dismissiveness that suggested she didn't quite belong. Born in Spain to a British mother and Spanish father, raised in France, educated in Switzerland, Hadley had joined the U.S. military through a specialized recruitment program designed to bring multilingual specialists into critical operations. She'd scored in the top percentile on every cognitive test, demonstrated exceptional emotional intelligence, and shown an uncanny ability to read situations and people with precision that bordered on prescient. None of that mattered. When it came to real missions, the operations briefing tent was already filling with personnel when Hadley slipped inside. She took her usual position near the equipment table, notebook ready, knowing she'd be needed to verify translations of intercepted communications, but not to participate in the actual operation. Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Reeves stood at the front, his weathered face stern as he addressed the assembled team. Operation Silent Thunder launches at 2200 hours, Reeves announced. We've got actionable intelligence on a high-value target in the Kandahar province. Compounds heavily fortified, multiple hostile combatants, civilian presence confirmed. This is going to be delicate. Hadley's pen moved across her notepad as Reeves detailed the mission parameters. She'd analyzed the intelligence reports he was referencing, had spent hours yesterday parsing through intercepted communications that revealed not just the target's location, but patterns of movement, guard rotations, even the emotional states of the people inside that compound. She'd written a detailed brief that included cultural considerations that could mean the difference between a clean extraction and a bloodbath. Team assignments, Reeves continued. Lieutenant Garrett, you're running point. Sergeant Torres, you're on tactical. Corporal Zhang handles communications. Private First Class O'Brien, you're our medic. The names continued, each one representing soldiers Hadley had trained alongside, eaten meals with, respected. But as the list grew, her name remained conspicuously absent. Perez, Reeves finally said, and Hadley's head lifted. You'll be monitoring from base communications. We need real-time translation if they start speaking Pashto or Dari during the operation. Monitoring from base. Again, Hadley nodded crisply, her expression neutral even as frustration burned in her chest. She'd provided the intelligence that made this mission possible, had identified patterns that even the seasoned operators had missed, but when it came to boots on the ground, she was relegated to sitting in an air-conditioned room listening to radio transmissions. After the briefing dispersed, she caught fragments of conversation that made her jaw tighten. Good call keeping Perez on base, she heard Torres say to Garrett. She's brilliant with languages, but field ops? She'd be a liability. Too much empathy, you know? Gets emotional about the wrong things. Garrett's response was quieter, but Hadley's excellent hearing caught it anyway. She's not built for violence. Some people aren't. Better she stays where she can help without getting in the way. Too emotional. Too empathetic. Not built for violence. Hadley had heard variations of these assessments for months. It didn't matter that she'd completed the same physical training as everyone else, that she could shoot with precision, that her hand-to-hand combat scores were above average. Her real weakness, in their eyes, was that she felt too much. They weren't entirely wrong. Hadley did feel deeply. She remembered the names of the children in the villages they'd visited during humanitarian missions. She noticed when local informants were terrified versus when they were lying. She felt the weight of every decision, every life affected by their operations. In a military culture that often valued emotional detachment, her sensitivity was seen as a flaw. What they didn't understand was that her emotional intelligence wasn't a weakness. It was a different kind of weapon, one she'd been honing in secret for months, preparing for a moment she hoped would never come, but knew eventually would. That evening, after her official duties ended, Hadley returned to her quarters and pulled out a locked case from beneath her bunk. Inside were materials she'd been gathering since her 3rd month at Viper. Detailed psychological profiles of enemy combatants based on intercepted communications, maps marked with cultural and religious significance, behavioral analysis frameworks she'd developed by studying thousands of hours of surveillance footage. But the most important item was a slim handbook she'd written herself, filled with techniques for de-escalation, negotiation, and psychological manipulation in high-stress combat situations. Every page represented hours of research into hostage negotiation, crisis intervention, and the emerging field of tactical empathy, using emotional intelligence as an operational tool. Nobody knew about Hadley's private research. To her fellow soldiers, she was just the translator who spent too much time overthinking things. They didn't know she'd been studying Delta Force operators' after-action reports, analyzing what worked and what failed in close-quarters combat situations involving civilians. They didn't know she'd developed a framework for reading microexpressions that could identify threats before they escalated. They certainly didn't know about the nickname she'd given herself during these late-night study sessions. Whisper Death. It started as a dark joke, a play on how quietly she moved through the base, how softly she spoke, combined with the lethal effectiveness of the psychological techniques she was developing. But over time, it became something more, a reminder that power didn't always announce itself with violence. The night before Operation Silent Thunder, Hadley couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk reviewing everything she knew about the target compound. The high-value target was a mid-level coordinator named Khalid Nazari, responsible for organizing attacks across 3 provinces. But the intelligence also showed he kept his extended family in the compound: a wife, 3 children, his elderly mother, and 2 younger brothers. The cultural implications were significant. In Pashtun culture, a man's honor was tied to his family's safety. The compound wasn't just a headquarters. It was a sanctuary. Any operation that threatened his family would trigger responses that standard military tactics might not anticipate. Hadley had written a supplementary brief explaining this, but she suspected it had been filed away as interesting but ultimately secondary information at T0200 hours. Unable to sleep, Hadley rose and walked to the operations center. The night duty officer, Specialist Park, looked up in surprise. "Can't sleep either?" Park asked, gesturing to the coffee pot. "Something like that," Hadley replied, pouring herself a cup. "Mind if I review the final mission parameters?" Park shrugged. "It's all approved already, but sure. You worried about something specific?" Hadley pulled up the operational timeline on one of the monitors. The plan called for a rapid insertion at 2200 hours, neutralization of guards, extraction of Nazari, and exfiltration within 18 minutes. Clean, efficient, standard special operations procedure. Except Hadley noticed something in the timeline that made her stomach clench. The insertion time coincided with evening prayer. In a devout household, and intelligence suggested Nazari's was extremely devout. That meant the entire family would be gathered in the main living area. The operational plan didn't account for this cultural reality. "Park," Hadley said carefully, "has anyone mentioned that the insertion time falls during Maghrib prayer?" "The what?" "Evening prayer. It's one of the 5 daily prayers in Islam. Given the layout of the compound and the family's religious practices, everyone will be in the main room, including the children." Park frowned. "That's for the operators to handle on the ground, right? They're trained for hostage situations." "They're trained for hostile hostage situations," Hadley corrected. "This is different. These aren't hostages being used as shields. They're family members who will genuinely try to protect Nazari because it's their religious and cultural obligation. The operators might interpret that as hostile intent." "You should brief Reeves," Park said. but they both knew the operation was too far along for major adjustments. The team was already preparing for insertion. Hadley stared at the monitor, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. She could feel it, the same intuition that had helped her catch intelligence patterns others missed, the same emotional radar that let her read people with uncanny accuracy. Something was going to go wrong. The cultural factors, the timing, the family dynamics, they were all collision points waiting to create chaos. She returned to her quarters and began preparing her gear. Not the standard communication equipment she'd been assigned for base monitoring, but field gear she'd been quietly maintaining for months. Tactical vest, enhanced first aid kit, her personal sidearm, and the handbook she'd created. If something went wrong, if the operation needed someone who understood the cultural and emotional landscape of that compound, she intended to be ready to. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. Operation Silent Thunder launched exactly on schedule at 2200 hours. Hadley sat in the communications center, headset on, monitoring the radio traffic as the team moved into position. The compound appeared on thermal imaging exactly as intelligence had predicted: multiple heat signatures clustered in the main structure's central room. Thermal shows 15 bodies in the primary target area, came Lieutenant Garrett's voice through the radio. More than expected, requesting confirmation on rules of engagement. Hadley's hands tightened on the edge of the console. 15 people meant the entire extended family, possibly guests. During evening prayer, they'd be shoulder to shoulder, making it nearly impossible to distinguish the target from civilians. ROE unchanged. Reeves responded from the Tactical Operations Center. Positive ID on Nazari required before engagement. Minimize civilian casualties. The operation proceeded with precision. Hadley listened as the team breached the outer perimeter, neutralized 2 guards with suppressed weapons, and approached the main structure. Everything was going according to plan until the moment they entered the building. Contact. Multiple hostile. No, wait. Garrett's transmission cut off, replaced by shouting in both English and Pashto. Hadley's translator training kicked in automatically, parsing the chaos of overlapping voices. A woman screaming for her children. An elderly voice reciting prayers. Male voices shouting warnings. And beneath it all, Nazari's voice, calm and commanding, instructing his family in Pashto to remain still, to show no fear, to trust in God's protection. Situation is Fubar, Torres transmitted. We've got the target, but he's using his family as a human shield. Mother, wife, kids, they're all clustered around him. He's telling them we'll kill them all if they move. Hadley leaned forward, her mind racing through cultural protocols. This wasn't a tactical problem anymore. It was a psychological one. Nazari had turned his family's religious obligation to protect him into a strategic advantage. The operators couldn't shoot without risk of hitting civilians. And any aggressive action would confirm Nazari's narrative that American soldiers were there to harm innocents. Request permission to negotiate, Garrett transmitted. We need a translator who can explain we're only here for Nazari. Negative, Reeves replied. Zhang speaks enough Pashto for basic communication. Maintain position and wait for an opening. Hadley grabbed her own radio, switching to the command frequency. Sir, Zhang doesn't have the cultural context for this situation. Nazari is using religious and family honor codes. A direct translation won't work. Perez, stay off this channel, Reeves snapped. This is an active operation. But Hadley was already pulling up the compound's layout on her monitor, overlaying it with the cultural analysis she'd prepared. She could see the problem clearly. The operators were treating this as a hostage situation. But it wasn't. Nazari's family genuinely believed they were protecting him, not because he was forcing them, but because their honor demanded it. The radio chatter grew increasingly tense. Minutes ticked by with no resolution. Hadley could hear the frustration in the operators' voices, the edge of desperation as they realized their window for extraction was closing. Then came the transmission that made her blood run cold. We've got movement outside the compound. Looks like reinforcements. Multiple vehicles approaching from the east. We need to extract now, or we're going to be overrun. The tactical situation had just become exponentially worse. If enemy reinforcements arrived before the team extracted Nazari, The entire operation would collapse into a firefight that would almost certainly result in civilian casualties and possibly the loss of American lives. Hadley made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She grabbed her field gear from beneath the console where she'd hidden it, ignoring Park's shocked expression. "Perez, what are you doing?" "Something stupid," Hadley replied, heading for the door. "Tell Reeves I'm going to fix his operation." She knew every second counted. The compound was 3 kilometers from the base, accessible by a supply route that saw minimal traffic after dark. Hadley commandeered a light tactical vehicle from the motor pool, showing her credentials to the confused guard and not giving him time to question her authority. The drive through the darkness felt surreal, her headlights cutting through dust that hung in the air like fog. She could hear the continued radio transmissions through her personal radio, the situation deteriorating by the minute. The enemy reinforcements were 5 minutes out. The team was preparing to abandon the operation and extract without Nazari. Rather than risk a prolonged engagement, Hadley pulled up to the compound's outer perimeter just as the first enemy vehicles appeared on the horizon. She could see the American operators' positions marked by the faint glow of their equipment through the darkness. Hadley approached the compound's main entrance with her hands raised, her weapon holstered. The moonlight cast long shadows across the courtyard where 2 American soldiers stood guard, their weapons tracking her movement with professional precision. "Identify yourself," one of them barked, and Hadley recognized Private O'Brien's voice. "Specialist Hadley Perez, Intelligence Division. I'm here to assist with the negotiation." "Perez? What the hell are you doing here?" O'Brien's surprise was evident even through his tactical mask. "This is an active combat zone." "I'm aware. Where's Lieutenant Garrett?" Before O'Brien could respond, Garrett himself emerged from the compound's entrance, his expression thunderous. "Specialist, you are in direct violation of about 17 different regulations right now. Get back to base immediately." "Sir, with respect, you need a cultural negotiator and you need one now. Those reinforcements will be here in 3 minutes. And if you're still in a standoff when they arrive, this turns into a massacre." Garrett's jaw worked, clearly torn between military protocol and tactical necessity. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, confirming Hadley's assessment. "Fine. You've got 2 minutes to make this work. But if you get yourself killed, I'm putting it in my report that you acted against direct orders." Hadley moved past him into the compound's main structure. The scene inside was exactly as she'd visualized from the radio chatter. Nazari surrounded by his family in a tight cluster. The Americans maintaining a perimeter with weapons raised, but unable to get a clear shot. The air was thick with tension and the metallic smell of fear. She took in the details rapidly. Nazari himself was in his mid-40s, bearded, wearing traditional clothing. His wife clutched their youngest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 5. His mother sat on the floor reciting prayers with closed eyes. The 2 younger brothers stood protectively on either side, their body language suggesting they would die before allowing anyone to harm their family. Every eye turned to Hadley as she entered. She could see the operators' confusion. They knew her face from the base, knew she was intelligence, but her presence here made no sense. She could see Nazari's calculating assessment, trying to determine what advantage or threat she represented. Hadley did something that made every American in the room tense. She lowered herself to sit cross-legged on the floor, removing her tactical helmet and setting it aside. In Pashtun culture, assuming a vulnerable seated position was a sign of peaceful intent, a demonstration that she came not as a warrior but as a guest seeking conversation. She began speaking in fluent Pashto, her accent carrying the formal dialect used in religious and diplomatic contexts. "Khalid Nazari, I come to speak with you about honor and family, about duty and protection. I am not here as your enemy, but as someone who understands the weight of responsibility you carry." Nazari's eyes widened slightly. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't this. He responded cautiously in Pashto, his voice carrying the same formal register she'd used. "You speak our language well, but you wear their uniform. You claim to understand honor while pointing guns at my children. Your children are not my target, nor are they targets of these soldiers. You know this. You are the only person in this room who believes your family is in danger from us. They believe it because you have told them to believe it, because their love and respect for you demands they trust your word." Behind her, Hadley could hear Garrett whispering urgently into his radio. updating Reeves on the developing situation. She ignored him, maintaining eye contact with Nazari. I understand the code of Pashtunwali, she continued, referencing the ancient tribal honor code that governed Pashtun culture. I understand Melmastia, the obligation to provide hospitality and protection. I understand Nong, honor and reputation. What you're doing now, using your family's love as a shield, this violates Nanawatai, the principle of asylum and protection. You endanger the very people you claim to protect. Nazari's expression shifted, a crack appearing in his calculated composure. Hadley had struck at the heart of his justification, using his own cultural framework against him. She pressed her advantage, her voice remaining soft but carrying absolute certainty. Your wife looks at you with love, but also with fear. Not fear of these soldiers, but fear of what you have become. Your mother prays, but I hear in her words a plea not for salvation, but for the son she raised to remember who he is. Your children will remember this night forever. Will they remember a father who protected them, or one who made them shields? Outside, the sound of vehicles grew louder. The enemy reinforcements were close now, perhaps 90 seconds away. Garrett moved to the doorway, his body language radiating urgency. Perez, we're out of time. But Hadley kept her focus on Nazari, watching the internal struggle play across his face. She could see him weighing his options, calculating odds, trying to find a path that preserved his honor while acknowledging the reality of his situation. There is no escape, Hadley said quietly. You know this. Your men arrive soon, and when they do, this room becomes a battlefield. Your family dies not because of American bullets, but because of choices you make right now. Is that the legacy you wish to leave your children? Nazari's youngest daughter began to cry, a soft whimpering that cut through the tension like a knife. His wife pulled the child closer, her eyes pleading with her husband. You speak of honor, Nazari said finally, his voice rough. But what honor is there in surrender? What lesson do I teach my sons about standing against invasion, against those who come to our lands with weapons and demands? You teach them that protecting family is the highest honor. You teach them that a man's strength is measured not by his willingness to die, but by his wisdom in knowing when to fight and when to preserve life. You teach them that loving your children means giving them a future. Hadley slowly reached into her tactical vest, moving deliberately to avoid triggering a defensive response from anyone in the room. She pulled out a photograph, one she'd taken from the intelligence files, showing Nazari's eldest son, who'd been killed in a coalition airstrike 2 years earlier. Ahmad was 17, she said softly, still in Pashto. He died believing he was protecting his family, protecting his faith. His death achieved nothing except creating a hole in your family that can never be filled. Your other children deserve better than to follow him into meaningless death. The photograph hit Nazari like a physical blow. His eyes locked on the image of his dead son, and for the first time, his composure completely shattered. Tears streamed down his face as his wife gasped, recognizing the photo. You have chosen a path of violence, Hadley continued, her own voice thick with emotion. That choice is yours to live with. But these people around you, they did not choose this. They deserve the chance to choose differently. Let them live. Let them have futures. That is the greatest act of love you can give them. The silence that followed felt eternal, broken only by the distant rumble of approaching vehicles and the soft sobbing of Nazari's wife. Then, slowly, Nazari raised his hands in surrender. Take me, he said in English, his voice broken. But you give me your word, your personal word, that my family will not be harmed. Hadley stood, helping him to his feet. You have my word. They will be protected and provided for. This I promise on my own honor. The extraction happened in a blur of controlled chaos. Torres and Zhang secured Nazari while Hadley spoke rapidly to his family in Pashto, explaining what would happen next, arranging for their safe transport to a protected location. By the time the enemy reinforcements arrived at the compound, the American team was already extracting through a secondary route. Nazari secured and his family safely separated from the tactical situation. Part 6. The helicopter ride back to base was tense and silent. Hadley sat across from Lieutenant Garrett, acutely aware that she'd violated direct orders and protocol. Nazari was secured between two operators, his head down, his entire posture suggesting defeat. The mission had been successful, but Hadley knew the price she'd pay for her unauthorized intervention. They touched down at Forward Operating Base Viper just before midnight. Hadley had barely stepped off the helicopter when she saw Lieutenant Colonel Reeves striding across the landing pad. His face set in an expression of controlled fury. "Specialist Perez, with me. Now." She followed him to his office, feeling the weight of every stare from personnel who'd heard about what happened. Inside the office, Reeves closed the door and turned to face her, his hands clenched at his sides. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You abandoned your post, stole a vehicle, entered an active combat zone without authorization, and inserted yourself into a special operations mission. I could have you court-martialed for any one of those infractions." "Yes, sir. I understand." "Do you?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you decided military chain of command doesn't apply to you. That you somehow know better than officers with decades of experience." Hadley met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I knew that compound. I knew the cultural dynamics at play. I knew the operators didn't have the tools to resolve the situation peacefully. And I knew if I waited for authorization, people would die. That wasn't your call to make." "No, sir, it wasn't. But I made it anyway. Because sometimes the right thing and the authorized thing aren't the same." Reeves stared at her for a long moment, then turned to look out his window at the base beyond. "Garrett's preliminary report says you saved the mission. That without your intervention, they would have either abandoned the extraction or engaged in a firefight that likely would have resulted in civilian casualties and possibly American deaths. Is that accurate?" "I believe so, yes, sir. Nazari himself has been cooperative since his capture. Says he'll provide intelligence in exchange for protection of his family. Credits you with showing him respect when we could have shown him violence." Reeves turned back to face her. "The problem is, I can't reward insubordination. I can't tell every specialist on this base that they should ignore orders whenever they think they know better. I'm not asking to be rewarded, sir. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate." A knock on the door interrupted them. Reeves called out permission to enter, and Hadley was surprised to see a man she didn't recognize, mid-40s, wearing civilian clothing despite clearly being military, with an intensity in his eyes that suggested special operations background. "Colonel Reeves," the man said with a nod, then turned to Hadley. "Specialist Perez. I'm Commander Daniel Vaughn, Delta Force Liaison. I've been reviewing the after-action reports from tonight's operation with considerable interest." Hadley's stomach dropped. Delta Force involvement meant this situation was even more serious than she'd realized. Vaughn studied her with an unsettling directness. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly. When you entered that compound tonight, did you believe you would survive?" The question caught Hadley off guard. She considered lying, offering some platitude about confidence in her training, but something about Vaughn's expression suggested he'd know. "No, sir. I assessed the probability of survival at approximately 30%. But the probability of mission success if I intervened was significantly higher than if I didn't." Vaughn nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Possibly both." He glanced at Reeves. "Colonel, with your permission, I'd like to speak with Specialist Perez privately." Reeves looked like he wanted to object, but he nodded and left his own office, closing the door behind him. Vaughn moved to sit on the edge of Reeves' desk, his posture casual, but his attention laser-focused. "I've spent the last 3 hours reviewing your file, Perez. Your intelligence analyses, your cultural briefings, your language proficiency scores. Impressive credentials. But what interests me more is what's not in your official file." He pulled out a tablet and turned it to show Hadley her own handwriting. Pages from the handbook she'd created, somehow photographed and digitized. "Tactical empathy in high-stress combat scenarios," Vaughn read from the screen. "Fascinating reading. Where did you learn techniques like this?" Hadley's mind raced. How had he accessed her private materials? "I developed them myself, sir. Research and analysis based on psychological studies and after-action reports." "Nobody taught you this? Nobody suggested you study hostage negotiation or crisis intervention?" "No, sir. I saw a gap in our operational capabilities and tried to fill it." Vaughn's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in his eyes, a spark of recognition or perhaps respect. "You saw a gap and filled it. Initiative like that is rare, especially when nobody's watching or evaluating you. Tell me, what made you think emotional intelligence could be weaponized?" "It's not weaponization, sir. It's application. We spend millions training soldiers to break things and kill people, but comparatively little teaching them to understand people. In counterinsurgency operations, in urban warfare, in any situation involving civilian populations, understanding human psychology is as important as marksmanship. Vaughn nodded slowly. The operators who were in that compound tonight, they're some of the best soldiers in the world. Elite training, years of experience. Yet they couldn't resolve a situation that you handled in under 3 minutes. What? Hadley chose her words carefully. They were trained to see the situation tactically. Threat assessment, fields of fire, extraction routes. All critical skills. But they couldn't see what Nazari was actually doing. He was performing honor for his family, creating a narrative where his capture could be framed as sacrifice rather than defeat. I gave him a different narrative, one where surrender became the honorable choice. You manipulated him. I gave him a path to preserve his dignity while accepting an inevitable outcome. That's not manipulation. It's offering options he couldn't see through his own cultural framework. Vaughn stood and walked to the window, looking out at the base. You've heard of tactical psychology units? Small teams embedded with special operations that provide real-time behavioral analysis and intervention. I've read about them, sir. Experimental programs, mostly. Not so experimental anymore. Delta Force has been running a pilot program for 18 months. Results have been mixed, lots of academic theory, not enough practical application in actual combat situations. He turned back to face her. Tonight, you demonstrated exactly what we've been trying to develop. Field-applicable emotional intelligence that produces tangible tactical results. Hadley's pulse quickened. Sir, are you offering me a position? I'm considering it. But first, I need to understand something. You've been at this base for 11 months, watching other soldiers get selected for operations while you were sidelined. That had to create resentment. Tonight, when you entered that compound, were you trying to prove something to yourself? Or to everyone who dismissed you? The question cut deeper than Hadley expected. She took a moment to examine her own motivations honestly. Both, probably. I won't pretend ego wasn't involved. But the primary motivation was knowing I had capabilities that could save lives, and watching those capabilities be ignored because they didn't fit conventional expectations of what makes a valuable operator. I was angry, yes, but I was more frustrated by the waste. The waste of potential, of possibilities, of the chance to resolve situations without bloodshed. We talk about winning hearts and minds, but then we send soldiers who are trained primarily to kill efficiently. That's not their fault. They're doing exactly what they were trained to do, but it's strategically short-sighted. Vaughn pulled out a phone and made a brief call. Give me Reeves. A pause. Colonel, I'm requesting temporary assignment of Specialist Perez to a Delta Force evaluation program. 30 days, after which she either returns to your command or transfers permanently to Special Operations. Another pause. No, this isn't optional. Yes, I have the authorization. Thank you, Colonel. He ended the call and looked at Hadley. You just bought yourself a 1-month trial. You'll be attached to Delta Force Operations as a tactical psychology specialist. Your job will be to do exactly what you did tonight. Read situations, identify psychological leverage points, and provide intervention when force isn't the optimal solution. Sir, I appreciate the opportunity, but I should mention that I have no formal training in psychology. Everything I know is self-taught. I'm aware. That's actually an advantage. You're not bound by academic frameworks that don't translate to combat situations. You've developed practical skills through observation and necessity. That said, you'll be working with a team that includes trained psychologists and behavioral specialists. Learn from them. But more importantly, teach them how to apply their knowledge in the field. Hadley's mind reeled with the implications. This was beyond anything she'd imagined when she drove to that compound. There's one more thing, Vaughn said, his tone shifting to something more serious. What you did tonight took considerable courage, but it also demonstrated a concerning disregard for chain of command. In Delta Force, we need people who can think independently and act decisively. But we also need people who understand when orders exist for good reasons. Can you balance those requirements? I can, sir. Tonight was exceptional circumstances. I won't make a habit of ignoring direct orders. See that you don't, because next time, there might not be a successful outcome to justify your insubordination. The Delta Force compound was located in a separate section of the base that Hadley had never accessed before. Higher security, more advanced equipment, and an atmosphere of focused intensity that made the regular base feel casual by comparison. Vaughn led her through a series of checkpoints, each one requiring biometric verification. You'll be working primarily with Echo Team, Vaughn explained as they walked. 6 operators plus support personnel. They're currently running operations in 3 provinces, focusing on high-value target acquisition and intelligence gathering. Your role will be to provide psychological assessment and intervention as needed. They entered a briefing room where 5 men and 1 woman were assembled, all wearing the casual confidence of elite operators. Vaughn made brief introductions. Team leader Garrett, no relation to the lieutenant from last night, along with operators named Jackson, Porter, Williams, Reed, and the sole woman, Campbell. This is Specialist Hadley Perez, Vaughn announced. As of today, she's your tactical psychology asset. Last night, she successfully negotiated a hostage situation that had Echo Team 6 stalled for 15 minutes. I want you to treat her expertise with the same respect you'd show any other specialist on your team. Campbell raised an eyebrow. Tactical psychology? That's actually a thing now. It is when it works, Vaughn replied. Perez, brief the team on your approach last night. Hadley stepped forward, acutely aware that she was being evaluated by people whose respect she'd need to earn. She walked them through the compound situation, explaining not just what she did, but why. The cultural considerations, the psychological dynamics. The specific language choices that had given Nazari a path to surrender, Porter interrupted midway through. Okay, but what if he'd called your bluff? What if he'd decided to go down fighting? Then the situation would have resolved exactly as it would have if I hadn't intervened. The operators had clear shots available. They were just trying to avoid civilian casualties. My presence didn't change their tactical options, only provided an additional avenue for resolution. Fair enough, Porter conceded. But most situations won't give you 3 minutes to play therapist. Combat moves fast. I'm not here to slow anyone down, Hadley replied. I'm here to identify opportunities for de-escalation that might be missed in the tactical assessment. If force is the only option, I stay out of the way. But if there's a chance to achieve the objective without shooting, isn't that worth exploring? The team exchanged glances, and Hadley could see the skepticism hadn't fully dissipated. She understood their position. They'd been trained for violence, had survived because of that training. And now someone was suggesting there might be alternatives to their core competencies. Jackson, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. I've read the after-action report from last night. The family aspect, using Nazari's dead son to break his resolve, that seems pretty cold-blooded for someone who's supposed to be about emotional intelligence. The observation stung because it was accurate. Hadley had used Nazari's grief as a weapon, had deliberately struck at his deepest wound to achieve her objective. The fact that it had worked didn't erase the ethical complexity. You're right, she admitted. What I did was manipulative and calculated. I exploited a father's grief to break his will. That's not something I feel good about. But the alternative was a firefight that might have killed his other children. Sometimes there are no good choices, only less harmful ones. Jackson studied her for a moment, then nodded. At least you're honest about it. I can work with that. Over the following week, Hadley immersed herself in Delta Force operations. She attended mission briefings, studied target profiles, and began developing psychological assessments of high-value individuals the team was tracking. The work was intense and demanding, requiring her to synthesize cultural intelligence, behavioral analysis, and tactical considerations into actionable recommendations. Her first real test came during a mission to extract an informant who'd been compromised. The informant, a local merchant named Rashid, had provided valuable intelligence but was now being hunted by enemy forces who discovered his cooperation. The extraction was supposed to be routine. Echo Team would secure the area, extract Rashid and his immediate family, and relocate them to a safe zone. But when the team arrived at Rashid's location, they found him barricaded inside his shop, refusing to leave. Through the door, he shouted in Dari that he wouldn't abandon his business, his home, everything he'd built over 40 years. The enemy forces were 15 minutes away, and Rashid was choosing suicide over relocation. Team leader Garrett turned to Hadley. This is your specialty. Make him understand he needs to leave now. Hadley approached the door, analyzing the situation rapidly. Rashid wasn't being irrational from his cultural perspective. In Afghan society, a man's honor was tied to his ability to provide and protect. Abandoning everything meant admitting defeat, becoming dependent on American charity. For someone of his generation and status, that was a fate worse than death. Hadley spoke through the door in fluent Dari, her voice carrying calm authority. Rashid, I am Hadley Perez. I know you feel you must stay to protect what is yours, but I need you to understand something important about honor and survival. You understand nothing. Rashid shouted back. You come here with your guns and your promises, and now you want me to run like a coward, to abandon everything my father built, everything I have given my children. I understand you're afraid, not of death, but of shame, of becoming a man without purpose, dependent on others for survival. But let me tell you what real shame would be. Hadley pressed her palm against the door, visualizing Rashid on the other side. Real shame is letting your pride kill your children. Real shame is choosing a building over the people who need you to live. Your father built this business, yes, but he built it for you, so you could have a life. Now you must give that same gift to your children, the gift of a future. My children will have nothing. No home, no business, no respect in the community. Your children will have a father. They will have the chance to build new lives in a place where their courage in helping us will be honored, not punished. You think staying here preserves your honor? The men coming to kill you, they will burn this shop anyway. They will take everything and destroy it. Your choice is not between keeping your honor and losing it. Your choice is whether your children watch you die defending an empty building or whether you teach them that protecting family is the highest honor. There was silence from behind the door. Hadley could hear Garrett monitoring enemy approach vectors. New time was running out. She made a calculated gamble. Rashid, I give you my word, my personal word, that we will help you rebuild. Not here, but somewhere safe. You will not be dependent on charity. You will work, you will provide, you will maintain your dignity. But only if you're alive to do it. The door opened slowly. Rashid stood there, a man in his 60s with tears streaming down his weathered face. You promise? You give me your word that I can work, that I can provide for my family. On my honor, I promise. The extraction happened with 60 seconds to spare. As the team evacuated with Rashid and his family, Hadley caught Campbell watching her with newfound respect. That was impressive, Campbell said over the vehicle radio. You basically promised him something we might not be able to deliver. What if relocation services can't find him work? Then I'll figure something out, Hadley replied. I gave my word. I'll keep it. Back at base, Vaughn reviewed the operation with evident satisfaction. 4 extractions this week, 3 of them resolved through negotiation rather than force. The psychological approach is proving its value. But there's something I need to discuss with you. He pulled up a file on his computer. We've received intelligence about a high-value target operating in the northern provinces. Former military commander, now coordinating insurgent operations across a wide area. Name's Farid Ahmadi. Standard procedure would be a kill or capture mission, but the intelligence suggests he's disillusioned with his current role and might be open to cooperation. Hadley studied the profile. Ahmadi was 43, educated, had served in the Afghan National Army before becoming disillusioned with government corruption. His insurgent activities were more about local protection than ideological commitment. You want me to attempt recruitment, she said. I want you to assess whether recruitment is possible. If you think he's persuadable, we'll set up a contact scenario. If not, we go with the standard approach. Hadley spent 3 days analyzing every piece of intelligence on Ahmadi. His communication patterns, his behavior towards civilians, his public statements. Everything suggested a man torn between competing loyalties. He protected his local community fiercely but showed reluctance to engage in operations that caused unnecessary casualties. That internal conflict was the leverage point she needed. The contact scenario was set for a neutral location, a village where Ahmadi was known to meet with local leaders. Echo Team would provide overwatch while Hadley made direct contact. Presenting herself as a coalition representative interested in dialogue rather than confrontation, the day of the contact, Hadley felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded high-stakes operations. She'd be walking into a situation where Ahmadi could easily decide she was too valuable a target to let walk away. But she'd learned that calculated risks were sometimes the only path to breakthrough results. She entered the village tea house, where Ahmadi was meeting with local elders. her presence immediately drawing attention. She wore civilian clothing rather than military uniform. A calculated choice to signal this was a political meeting rather than a military operation. Ahmadi looked up from his conversation, his hand moving instinctively toward the weapon at his side. Hadley raised her hand slowly, showing she was unarmed. "Farid Ahmadi," she said in Dari. "I am Hadley Perez. I've come to discuss whether your war serves the people you're trying to protect." The elders in the room tensed, clearly expecting violence. But Ahmadi studied her with sharp intelligence, assessing whether she represented threat or opportunity. "You walk into a room of men who consider you their enemy," he replied slowly. "Either you are very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both. Why should I not simply take you prisoner? Because you're smart enough to recognize that I wouldn't be here unless my capture served my side's interests more than yours. I'm here because I believe you're a man who's lost faith in the path you're on, and I'm offering a conversation about alternatives." Ahmadi gestured to the seat across from him. "Then sit, Hadley Perez. Let us have this conversation. But know that words alone will not change the reality of occupation and resistance." Hadley sat across from Ahmadi, acutely aware of Echo Team positioned in Overwatch locations throughout the village. Porter had a clear line of sight through the tea house window. Campbell was monitoring communications from a rooftop position. They could extract her if the situation deteriorated. But success depended on her ability to establish genuine dialogue rather than relying on military backup. "You speak of occupation," Hadley began, accepting the tea that one of the elders poured. "But I wonder if you've considered what comes after. When foreign forces eventually leave, when the current conflict ends, who leads? Men who spent years fighting for control, or men who spent years building capacity for governance?" Ahmadi's expression remained guarded but interested. "You think I should abandon my people to work with those who bomb our villages and kill our children? I think civilian deaths from coalition operations haunt the people who order them more than you might believe. But I also think insurgent operations create conditions that make those tragedies more likely. When fighters hide among civilians, when weapons are stored in schools and mosques, the line between combatant and civilian becomes impossible to maintain. So you blame us for our own casualties." One of the elders interjected angrily. "I blame war. I blame the systems that created this conflict. But mostly, I blame the fact that people like Commander Ahmadi, educated, capable, genuinely concerned for their communities, are forced to choose between collaboration that feels like betrayal or resistance that brings endless suffering." Hadley leaned forward, making direct eye contact with Ahmadi. "I've read your background. You studied engineering in Kabul. You served honorably in the National Army. You could have taken a comfortable position in government, collected bribes like so many others, lived well while your community struggled. Instead, you chose to fight. That took courage and principle. But now I'm asking you to consider whether your fight actually helps the people you're trying to protect." Ahmadi set down his teacup carefully. "You speak well, Hadley Perez. But words are easy. Show me how cooperation serves my community better than resistance." This was the moment Hadley had prepared for. She pulled out a tablet and showed him satellite imagery of the valley where his primary operations occurred. "These are irrigation projects that were planned for your region 3 years ago. They never happened because insurgent activity made the area too dangerous for development teams. This school," she zoomed in on a specific location, "was supposed to be rebuilt and expanded. Canceled due to security concerns. Medical clinic, canceled. Agricultural extension program, canceled." She looked up at him. "Your resistance is effective enough that it prevents development, but not strong enough to actually remove coalition presence. The result is a permanent state of disruption that hurts the very people you're trying to help. That's not strategy. That's tragic irony." Ahmadi's jaw tightened. "And if I cooperate? If I convince my fighters to stand down? Coalition forces will just claim victory and leave us to face retaliation from other insurgent groups. Not if you become part of the security solution. Your knowledge of local dynamics, your relationships with tribal leaders, your understanding of the region's needs, those are assets. Work with us to identify genuine threats versus local protection forces. Help us distinguish between ideological fighters who want endless war and community defenders who want stability. Your cooperation could mean the difference between continued conflict and actual peace." One of the elders spoke up, his tone skeptical. "These promises mean nothing. We have heard them before, from Russians, from previous governments. Always promises, never delivery. Hadley nodded, acknowledging the validity of his cynicism. You're right to be skeptical. But consider this. I'm not promising paradise or immediate transformation. I'm promising something more valuable, agency. Right now, Commander Ahmadi's choices are constrained to different forms of violence. Work with us, and his choices expand to include political influence, resource allocation, actual governance. That's not a small thing. Ahmadi stood and walked to the window, looking out at the village. Hadley could see the internal struggle playing across his shoulders. The weight of a decision that would affect not just himself, but everyone who'd followed him into insurgency. If I consider this, he said slowly, still facing away, what guarantees do I have? How do I know this is not simply a trap to capture me and my fighters? You don't, Hadley admitted. Just as I don't know whether this entire meeting is a trap to capture me and extract intelligence about coalition operations. We're both taking risks based on the belief that continued conflict serves neither of our interests. The difference is, I came here willing to have this conversation. That should tell you something about coalition willingness to find alternatives to violence. Ahmadi turned back to face her, and Hadley saw the decision forming before he spoke. I will not agree to anything today, but I will think about what you've said, and I will agree to another meeting in 1 week where we discuss specific terms. If your words can become reality, perhaps cooperation serves my community better than my bullets. The week following Hadley's meeting with Ahmadi was filled with intense preparation. Vaughn assembled a team of specialists, military lawyers, civil affairs officers, development experts, to draft a concrete proposal that could transform Ahmadi's cooperation from theoretical possibility to practical reality. Hadley served as the bridge between these different domains, translating bureaucratic language into culturally meaningful terms. The problem, she explained during one planning session, is that we're offering him a role in a system he fundamentally distrusts. We need to show him power that's real and immediate, not promises of future influence that might never materialize. Campbell, who'd become something of an ally, nodded in agreement. So what's the answer? We can't just hand him governance of a province. No, but we can give him authority over specific projects with measurable impact. Let him control resource allocation for irrigation development in 3 villages. Give him oversight of security coordination in his operational area. Make him responsible for vetting local contractors. That's tangible power he can use to demonstrate value to his community. The second meeting with Ahmadi took place in a more formal setting, a district government building that had been secured by coalition forces. This time, Hadley wasn't alone. She brought 2 civil affairs officers and a tribal elder who'd agreed to serve as a neutral witness to any agreements reached. Ahmadi arrived with 3 of his senior commanders, all visibly armed but showing restrained body language that suggested willingness to negotiate rather than fight. The tension in the room was palpable as both sides took their seats across a long wooden table. Hadley opened the discussion by presenting the concrete proposal her team had developed. Commander Ahmadi, what we're offering is a pathway from insurgent leader to community developer. You would maintain authority over your current area of operations, but that authority would shift from military resistance to civilian governance and security coordination. She walked him through each component: oversight of development projects, coordination with coalition security forces to distinguish legitimate threats from local disputes, representation of community interests in district-level planning. Each role came with specific authorities, defined resources, and measurable outcomes. Ahmadi listened intently, occasionally conferring quietly with his commanders. When Hadley finished, he leaned back and studied her with calculating intensity. This proposal gives me responsibility, but limits my power. I coordinate security, but don't control military forces. I oversee projects, but don't control budgets. You're asking me to become an administrator, not a leader. I'm asking you to become a builder instead of a destroyer, Hadley replied. Leadership isn't measured by how many guns you control. It's measured by how many lives you improve. The question is whether you want to be remembered as the man who fought endlessly or the man who created lasting peace. One of Ahmadi's commanders spoke up, his tone aggressive. Peace created by surrendering to occupation? That's not peace. That's defeat dressed in diplomatic language. Hadley turned her attention to him. What's your name? Rashid. Rashid, I understand your anger, but I need you to answer honestly. Has your resistance improved life for the people in your villages? Are children safer? Are families more prosperous? Is the future brighter because of the fighting? Rashid's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. The silence was answer enough. Violence creates temporary tactical advantages, Hadley continued. But it doesn't build schools, doesn't create jobs, doesn't give young people alternatives to endless war. Commander Ahmadi has the respect and trust of his community. He can use that to accomplish things that bullets never will, but only if he's willing to try a different approach. The negotiations continued for 3 hours, working through details of authority, resources, security guarantees, and dispute resolution mechanisms. Hadley found herself drawing on every skill she'd developed: cultural understanding, emotional intelligence, practical negotiation tactics. She gave ground on some points while holding firm on others, always maintaining focus on the ultimate objective, transforming Ahmadi from enemy to partner. Finally, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the room, Ahmadi made his decision. I will accept this proposal on a trial basis. 6 months to demonstrate whether cooperation produces better results than resistance. But I want personal assurance from you, Hadley Perez, that promises made today will not be forgotten tomorrow. Hadley extended her hand across the table. You have my word. I'll personally oversee implementation and hold both sides accountable to these commitments. Ahmadi shook her hand, and in that moment, Hadley felt the weight of what had just been accomplished. This wasn't just one man's decision to stand down. It was a potential template for how other insurgent leaders might be convinced to choose peace over endless conflict. As Ahmadi and his commanders departed, Vaughn approached Hadley with an expression of reserved satisfaction. That was exceptional work. You just accomplished something that conventional military operations couldn't achieve in years. But you realize you're now personally responsible for making sure those commitments are kept. I know, and I will. There's something else we need to discuss, Vaughn said, gesturing for her to follow him to a private room. Once inside, he pulled up a file on a secure tablet. Your trial period with Delta Force ends in 1 week. Based on your performance, we're prepared to offer you permanent assignment as a tactical psychology specialist. But there's a complication. Vaughn turned the tablet toward Hadley, showing her a classified document with multiple security clearances required. The work you've been doing, negotiation, psychological intervention, cultural mediation, it's proven valuable enough that we're establishing a formal program. Not just for Delta Force, but across special operations. You'd be one of the founding members. Hadley scanned the document, her mind racing through implications. This is exactly what I hoped would happen when I started developing these techniques. But you said there's a complication? The program requires operators who can function in both negotiation and combat roles. We can't have specialists who are only effective in peaceful scenarios. You'd need to complete full special operations training, advanced combat skills, hostile environment survival, everything regular operators go through. Can you handle that? The question touched on Hadley's deepest insecurity. She'd proven herself capable of psychological intervention, of reading situations and people with exceptional skill. But could she match the physical capabilities of elite operators? Could someone who'd been dismissed as too emotional survive the most demanding military training in existence? I can handle it, she said, hearing the certainty in her own voice. I've spent my entire military career being told I wasn't enough, not strong enough, not aggressive enough, not traditionally qualified enough. Every time, I proved them wrong by being excellent at what I could do. Now you're asking if I can do more? Yes, I can. Vaughn studied her for a long moment. I believe you, but I need you to understand what you're committing to. This training will test you beyond anything you've experienced. You'll be working alongside people who've spent years developing capabilities you'll need to master in months. There will be moments when you question whether you belong, whether you're capable, whether the cost is worth it. I've already had those moments, sir. Every day for the past year. The difference is, now I have proof that my approach works. That gives me something worth fighting for. 3 months later, Hadley stood in a training facility designed to break exceptional soldiers and rebuild them as something more capable. The Special Operations Qualification course was legendary for its difficulty, and Hadley had been granted entry despite not meeting traditional prerequisites. That fact alone made her a target for skepticism from instructors and fellow candidates. The physical training was brutal, ruck marches that seemed endless, obstacle courses that tested strength and agility simultaneously, combat scenarios that required split-second decisions under extreme stress. Hadley struggled with some elements, particularly those that required pure upper body strength. But she compensated with technique, determination, and an absolute refusal to quit. The psychological components played to her strengths. Hostage negotiation exercises, cultural simulation scenarios, high-stress decision-making tests, she excelled at all of them. What surprised her instructors was how she integrated both skill sets, using physical capability to create psychological leverage and vice versa. 6 months into training, Hadley participated in a final evaluation exercise that would determine whether she qualified for the new tactical psychology program. The scenario involved a hostage situation in a mock embassy compound with multiple hostile actors, civilian hostages, and time-sensitive intelligence objectives. Hadley's team entered the compound using standard tactical procedures. But within minutes, the situation deteriorated. The hostage-takers were more sophisticated than anticipated, and the team's communications specialist was killed in the initial engagement, leaving them without their planned coordinator. Hadley adapted instantly. She used her language skills to establish dialogue with the hostage-takers while simultaneously directing her team's tactical positioning through hand signals. She identified the lead hostage-taker's psychological pressure points, his concern for his own family, his fear of being perceived as weak by his subordinates, and used those insights to create an opening for negotiated resolution. When negotiations stalled, she didn't hesitate to shift to direct action, coordinating with her team to neutralize threats while minimizing risk to hostages. The operation concluded successfully with all hostages rescued and primary objectives achieved. The evaluation team's feedback was unanimous. Hadley Perez represented exactly what the tactical psychology program was designed to create: an operator who could function effectively across the full spectrum of military operations. From peaceful negotiation to direct combat, Commander Vaughn presented her with the program's distinctive patch during a small ceremony, attended by Echo Team and other Delta Force personnel who'd worked with her over the past months. Specialist Perez has demonstrated something we've long suspected but struggled to prove, Vaughn said. That emotional intelligence, cultural understanding, and psychological insight aren't soft skills, they're force multipliers. She's shown that the most effective operators aren't those who rely solely on violence, but those who understand when violence is necessary and when alternatives exist. As Hadley accepted the patch, Campbell leaned over and whispered, "So are you going to tell us where the whispered death call sign came from? Everyone's been speculating." Hadley smiled. "It's something I called myself during training, before anyone took me seriously. A reminder that power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes the quietest approach is the most lethal, not because it kills, but because it makes killing unnecessary." 2 years after that compound negotiation that had started everything, Hadley led a team into another crisis situation. This time, she wasn't an unauthorized specialist making a desperate gamble. She was a fully qualified operator with authority and resources. But her approach remained fundamentally the same: understand the human elements, identify psychological leverage points, and create pathways for resolution that preserve life whenever possible. The mission was successful. They all were, more often than not, because Hadley had proven that understanding people was just as important as understanding tactics. She'd shown that emotional intelligence wasn't weakness but strength. That empathy could be weaponized not for destruction but for de-escalation and resolution. Standing on a rooftop in Kandahar, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, Hadley thought about the young specialist she'd been dismissed, overlooked, told she was too emotional for real military work. That woman had been right to refuse those limitations, right to develop her skills in secret, right to take that unauthorized risk that changed everything. Because sometimes proving them wrong isn't about becoming what they expect. It's about being so undeniably excellent at what you do that they have no choice but to change their expectations. Hadley keyed her radio. "Command, this is Whisper Death. Mission complete. All personnel accounted for. Objective achieved through negotiated surrender. Returning to base." She smiled as she heard the acknowledgement. Somewhere, someone was learning that the most dangerous operator isn't always the one with the most weapons. Sometimes it's the one who knows exactly when not to use them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.